I tell my children all of the time that if you do the right thing, life will go well for you. And by saying this, I hope to eventually teach them that there are consequences associated to their actions, right? And this works really well in our context of our home because most of the time, mom and I are in control of the rewards and the consequences that my child would face whenever they do said action. But oftentimes, I think we take this mindset that if we do things right, life will go well for us. We take this mindset into our adult life as well, wanting to believe that if we continue doing the right things, that life will go well for us. But in reality, if you've lived an adult life, this isn't always the case, is it? Life isn't always that simple. So have you ever found yourself doing all of the right things, but all they end up doing for you is leading you towards more hardship, betrayal, and even suffering? In reality, obedience will not always necessarily mean that you'll have an easy life and everything will go well for you. So then what do we do when undeserved difficulty, undeserved betrayal, and undeserved suffering come our way? And that's what we're going to seek to answer this morning as we continue in our series, Overcome, where we are looking at the story of Joseph in Genesis. You see, we're in the second week of this series, and last week we took a look and understood a little bit about who Joseph is. We got a little bit of his background. And we saw last week that what was a setback for him was actually God set up for him to continue on the path that God had for him. And we saw that we can overcome rejection that many of us face by remaining obedient to God's plans, by holding on to God's timing and holding on to his promises. But this week, we're going to continue on the story of Joseph, and we're going to see how he overcomes betrayal that comes his way. And we're going to see that when God redirects our plans, he's actually rescuing us so that we can accomplish our purpose. And we're going to see that envy, when it's growing in the secret places of your heart, can actually lead to public destruction. And we're going to see that God measures our faithfulness not with our finish lines. And so our text today is going to be in Genesis chapter 37. We're going to be starting at verse 12. So if you brought your Bibles, I encourage you, turn there with me as we read it together in a moment. And if not, it'll be available on the screens beside me. But we're picking up in the story of Joseph today, and last week he was introduced to us as one of the youngest of his brothers. And we noticed that there was nothing inherently unique to him in his family except one thing that stood out, and that was that he was loved by his father more than the rest of his brothers. And because of that, he was given an exceptional gift, an ornate robe. And we learned that there was nothing that Joseph did to earn this favor. It was just because he was born to his father in his old age. And we've seen the father's favoritism for him on display, and his brothers have now started to hate him because of that. They've grown cold towards Joseph because of the things that he's been receiving. So with his hatred in their hearts, let's see how the brothers choose to act towards Joseph. So picking up the text in verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to them, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with your flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the field and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I've heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Joseph, you see here in this passage, is sent by his father out to go check on his brothers in Shechem. And Shechem, just to give you a little bit of this kind of location and geographical setting, Shechem is about 50 miles away from their home-based valley of Hebron. So Joseph sets out on this journey, and when he finally arrives at Shechem, he does not encounter his brothers there. Instead, he encounters this man who approaches him and sees Joseph wandering out in the fields looking for something, and then he asks him, "What are you looking for?" And after telling this man that he's looking for his brothers, this stranger just happened to be able to identify who his brothers are that were in this valley, and then just so happened to overhear a conversation that they were having, telling them, announcing where they are headed next, that they were going to Dothan. which is Dothan is another 14 miles away from Shechem, where he was searching for his brothers. So the journey in total would have taken Joseph probably about 4 or 5 days in order to complete. And so we get a little insight into Joseph's character through this portion of the story, don't we? Start to see his persistence, his determination to accomplish the job that he was set out by his father to complete, to go check on his brothers. Nothing is going to stop him. He's going to be persistent and go find them so he can bring a report back to his father. But what's really interesting in this story is the position of the stranger who redirects him. Because as we're reading the story together, as we're recounting, it doesn't seem a bit odd that this random person in the valley, 50 miles away from his hometown, would have been close enough to his brothers while they were gazing the flocks to actually overhear their conversation about where they were going. And wouldn't it be interesting, and what are the odds that he would be there at the exact right time when Joseph was looking for his brothers so that he can let him know to continue on his way another 14 miles away from the place they were supposed to be? You see, if this person had not been in this location at the exact moment that Joseph was wandering in the field, what would have happened? Joseph most likely would have gone home to be with his father and would have escaped what is about to come next. But the author is making it very clear that God placed a person here at just the right moment to make sure that Joseph would be able to continue on his journey and be delivered into the hands of his brothers. And I think this happens in our life as well. You've probably experienced it, I know I have, where God intentionally redirects us along a path that we did not initially see coming. So have you ever felt like there are certain obstacles that just rose to the occasion in your life that you weren't actually anticipating? And they just redirected your course pretty instantaneously. You see, those instances, as you look back on them, they may have been God at work to keep you on the path that He is intending for you. Because when God redirects your plans, He's actually rescuing you so that you can continue to be on your path for your purpose. In Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, it says this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." See, He has a path, a plan, a purpose for all of us, and He is continuing to use different factors that come up in our life to redirect us towards His plans and purposes. So what this means for us is that we should do what the Proverbs verse says in the beginning of trusting in God. We should trust in God's redirections when they come up. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not always easy for me. When I get redirections and I get thrown off course, I tend to jump into being frustrated first rather than trusting that God has this under control. Because maybe you've experienced redirections like this. Maybe you've lost a job and you didn't know what was going to happen next. Maybe there was a relationship that you were in that came to an end and you weren't anticipating it. Maybe there was a dream that you had and something came up and it got delayed or pushed aside. What if instead of resisting God's redirection, we actually trusted that He was still guiding us, that He was still directing our path, and that He still had a good purpose in mind, even when we don't understand it? So this week, I want you to think about those situations that maybe you are in currently, where you're frustrated by God's redirection. I want you to ask yourself, how might God be redirecting me so that I can be on the even greater path? You see, we can trust God's guidance even when we don't explicitly see it. He is always at work in our lives, and He's always guiding us towards His plans and purposes, even when we don't understand it, even when we don't see Him. Joseph was persistently obedient to his father. He was following God's redirection, and it led him straight into the hands of his brothers. So let's continue reading. Let's see what his brothers decide to do with this opportunity to take advantage of their brother. Picking up the text back in verse 18, it says this: "But they saw him coming in the distance, and before he reached him, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that ferocious animals devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his clothes, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't here. Where can I turn now?" In verse 18, while Joseph was still a distance away from his brothers, they spotted him. And because of their hatred towards him, they plotted to kill him. They started talking amongst themselves about what they would do, and they reached a consensus that they would throw him into a cistern. Just a few verses earlier in the beginning of the chapter, we saw these brothers were starting to get a little bit jealous of Joseph's favoritism. And it started progressively to turn into hatred towards Joseph, where they couldn't say a kind word to him. And now this plot takes a serious turn when they decide they hate him so much they want to end his life. But then Reuben, he comes alongside the rest of the brothers. He's the oldest of the brothers, we find out. But the author lets us know what's going on in his mind. He has his own plans for what he wants to do with Joseph. So then he pipes up to the other brothers. And it could have been because he felt responsibility for Joseph's life. It could have been that he felt the need to spare him, but he speaks up to spare his life, and he was outnumbered. He was shot down. And most likely, his intervention, the reason that he spoke up, actually wasn't because he had compassion for Joseph. It probably wasn't motivated because he felt bad for him. It was actually because of his own greed. Because if he were to leave Joseph alive, take him and bring him back to his father, he might regain some favor in his father's eyes once again. But then they decide to continue on with their plan and dispose of Joseph. And at that exact moment, there happens to be a caravan to Egypt that is passing by. And Dothan was a part of an established trade route to Egypt, so this isn't super surprising to us as the reader, but the timing of it is so key, that his brothers were still around while Joseph was in the cistern. And it turns out that these Ishmaelites that came by in the caravan, they're actually second or third cousins to Joseph and his brothers, helping Judah then think of this plot that he would then be able to sell Joseph to some of his family members and dispose of him that way. And here we learn a lot about Judah as well. The plot thickens, and they choose to sell him rather than kill him, which Reuben already was saying that he didn't want to kill Joseph, but Judah gets away with it. And this is part of the character that that the author is developing in who Judah is. Because we're going to find more stories about Judah, and it turns out he is a bit of a bad man, but a bit of a persuader. And he likes to manipulate situations to work in his favor. And so they end up being able to sell Joseph, keep him alive, and he gets the 20 shekels of silver. Which that 20 shekels of silver is not much for all of these brothers who are going to have to split it. And this family is a wealthy family, so they don't really need the money. But they're all happy because at least they get something rather than nothing. And so they continue on, they sell Joseph to this Egyptian caravan. And then we see Reuben's response when his plot is foiled. And we see that his motivation was truly greed, because now he doesn't get to, while Joseph is still alive, he's still upset. He doesn't get to take Joseph and gain favor in his father's eyes anymore. And therefore he tears his clothes out of rage and upsetness because things did not go his way. We learn a lot about Joseph's brothers through this story. They are kind of the climax of Joseph's journey right here. And the author is trying to tell us different things about these brothers and picture them in a certain way. And the thing that we're supposed to notice about them and this story is how they have let envy begin to rule their lives. And that envy has started to take them into really dark places. This story is illuminating the power of envy. Because it's envy at the beginning of the story, envy over Joseph's favoritism by his father, over the dreams that he had that he would rule over them. All of this has started to birth resentment in the brothers' hearts towards Joseph. And it's moved them from resentment into hatred and then into murder. You see how envy fuels these destructive actions of the brothers. Their envy was so deeply rooted that they felt absolutely no remorse for the things that they had done. Did you notice in the passage in verse 25, it said that after they threw Joseph into the cistern, they sat down and ate their meal. They were totally fine by throwing him in the cistern. Clearly, they felt no remorse for what they had done. And that's what reveals to us the power of envy. And when we allow envy to grow in the secret places of our heart, it can lead to this kind of outward destruction. And I think oftentimes when we think about envy and what envy is, we think of it as wanting what someone else has. But I wonder if that definition is actually a little bit insufficient for us. And the reason that I came to that conclusion is because I have 2 little children, and they oftentimes get very envious of what each other has. Just last night at dinner, Allison prepared plates for each of the kids, and they both had equal amounts on their plates. But because of the different color, she set them before them, and all they wanted to do was take the other person's, and they were upset with what they had because then they wanted what the other person had. But I think it goes beyond just getting what you see the other person has. That will not quench what is happening when we have envy in our heart. Because even though they received the same amount of food, they still wanted what the other person had, meaning that they didn't want the other person to have it at all. At the heart of envy is not just the idea of wanting something that someone else has, but actually wanting to ruin the person who has the thing that you want. That is the ugliness of what envy can be when you allow it to take root in your heart. And it's so interesting, the world that we live in, because it makes a lot of its money off of this idea of envy that they allow to stir in your heart. Think about advertising, think about social media. All it does is categorize on this desire that we want more than we currently have. And then it festers in us, and we start feeling bitter because we're not getting as much attention as the other person that we're watching. We're not getting as much success as the other person that we see. We're not getting as much recognition as the other person. And we start to convince ourselves then that we deserve what they have, and they don't deserve what they have. And what started as envy towards the coat that Joseph got from his father, when they had the opportunity to actually seize the coat from him, they didn't even care about it anymore, did they? They threw the coat off of him. It was on the ground, and all they wanted to do was throw Joseph into the cistern and destroy him. They could care less about the object that he possessed. And this is envy's progression when we allow it to take root in our heart. We start to think that those people don't deserve what they have. And I should have it all. And then I need to be the one to make sure that they lose what they have been given. That's the play of envy that took place in Joseph's brothers' hearts. Reuben and Judah are at the heart of this story to show us how evil their hearts have truly become. They have harbored envy in their heart, allowed it to produce all kinds of destructive behavior. And so for us listening to the story today, we need to be wiser than they are. And we need to guide our hearts against envy. Because holding on to our envy doesn't just have us hurt other people. It actually will destroy our own hearts as well. So I want you to start to think about how envy might be playing a role in your life. Do you see yourself replaying those scenarios over and over again when someone else got more than you have been given? You see, envy doesn't just hurt the person you're mad at, it poisons your own heart. It leads to increased bitterness, resentment, and ultimately destruction and harm towards other people. So what resentment are you holding on to that is leading you towards these destructive actions? How is your life characterized by envy? And to find out, start to ask yourself these questions. How do you react when a coworker in your office gets the promotion and you didn't? How do you respond to a friend who got something that you have actually been longing for? You see, I believe envy doesn't necessarily have to drive us to murder that person, but envy can play a more subtle role in our lives today. Because oftentimes, if a coworker got the promotion and we didn't, we might find ourselves insulting them behind their backs, ridiculing them for the work that they got, saying to ourselves they don't actually deserve it, maybe making them look bad in front of their boss so that you can look better in comparison. These are the subtle ways that envy can begin to take root in our hearts. And maybe with our friends who have more than us, maybe we start to talk about them behind their backs and devalue them as individuals and put ourselves forward. See, envy can take root in our hearts in such simple ways. It's so easy for us to move down that path, and so we need to be careful to guard ourselves against envy. And the way that I want to give you to do that, to guard against envy, is to practice contentment and to celebrate others. So first, I want you to think about ways you can show more contentment in your daily life for the things that you've been given. Consider everything you have a blessing and not focus on what others have around you. And then next, I want you to think about how you can celebrate those around you when they get good things that happen to them. How can you come alongside them and exacerbate the joy that they're having? Help them celebrate even further rather than close up and be frustrated at the things that they get to enjoy. So while Joseph has now been sold into a life of servitude, we know that the story is not yet over. But the brothers, they have created kind of a mess here, so they need to cover it up. So let's pick up the text in verse 31 and let's see how they choose to cover up the actions that they have done. Picking up the text in verse 31, it says this: Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. See, here we get to see the brothers' cover-up plan. And they dipped Joseph's robe in blood, and they brought it before their father, and they allowed their father to draw his own conclusions, that Joseph had been killed by some ferocious animal. They didn't butt in to clarify the story. They let him think that his son is dead, and he's literally inconsolable because of this. He's weeping bitterly and says he will be mourning until he joins Joseph in his death. In this text, it doesn't tell us whether these brothers felt any remorse for the actions that they did that caused their father such overwhelming grief. But the last verses, they indicate for us that the story is not over. We're going to hear about Joseph once again, and we are left to feel that his fate is hanging in the balance. There's suspense that the narrator leaves us with, and he doesn't continue his thought until chapter 39. And so the brothers, what we see them doing here is covering up their sin by deceiving their father, and it leads to their father's deep grief. And their effectiveness of being able to cover up the sin that they committed makes it seem to us as the reader as if evil has won out. But God is not yet done. And I think oftentimes when we encounter hardship, when we encounter betrayal, when we encounter suffering of this world, when there's evil things that happen to us, we may feel like that is it. We're at the end of the road. We are hopeless, and nothing can be done about it. This story reminds us that that isn't the case. Because even though life may seem unfair, and all of us know good people who have bad hands dealt to them and experience evil and tragedy of the world that they did not deserve, this story shows us that God is still going to work in and through it. He is not yet done. There is no reason to continue to be hopeless because God has not abandoned you, just like he did not abandon Joseph. All of this redirection was a part of God's plan and God's purpose that he had for Joseph, and the same is true in your life as well. No matter the difficulty you are experiencing, God has the power to redeem it for good. Evil does not have the final say. And God does not promise us that he's going to guard us from all evil. He says very explicitly, we will suffer at the hands of the world. But he does promise us that he can accomplish good through the suffering we have to endure. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, he says this, or Paul writes this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. You see, whenever evil comes, God is able to redeem it. He is the one who is ultimately in control. Joseph, he was his father's favorite son. He was chosen by God to be used for a special purpose. And yet, when we read our story today, we saw that rather than him being honored, he was actually found at the bottom of a pit. Joseph felt completely betrayed, felt completely abandoned. But God wasn't done with his story. And I can imagine for Joseph, who was going through that in that moment, all he set out to do on this journey was to accomplish the task that his father gave him. But how it ended up, rather than Joseph giving a report back to his father about his brothers went to his father and gave a report back about him. And you can imagine the frustration that he would have experienced seeing that his plans are not going the way that he thought they would. He's not getting the final outcome that he once desired. And the reason that this is so important for us to focus on is that Joseph, he did not reach the finish line he set out to on his journey. But God didn't measure him by his finish line, measured him by his faithfulness. While Joseph set out on this journey, he was supposed to bring back a report. He did not complete that journey. But God saw him and was with him because of his obedience. And the harder path that he had him on redirected him and led him to an even greater plan that God had in store for his life. You see, God measures faithfulness, not our finish lines. Our service to God is not compromised by the end result that we are supposed to achieve. God cares more about the process of us going through the journey and the path that he has in store for us. I want you to think about those seasons of difficulty that you've experienced in your own life. Think about those that you've already walked through. Now that you get to replay it back and look from a new perspective, you can start to see how God was using that for good. And this week, when you're facing frustration, I encourage you to take a moment and ask God, help me trust that you are working even when I can't see it. Even when it seems like the evil of this world, the hardship has you pinned down, know that God is still working behind the scenes. And we know that Joseph's story will continue and that God is also not done yet with our lives as well. So we saw through this story that there is so much that we get to hold on to, so much encouragement that we receive from it. But in reality, our obedience will not always mean that we have an easy life. It doesn't always mean that life is going to go well with us. So what do we do when undeserved difficulty, undeserved betrayal, undeserved suffering come our way? Well, we need to remember that the hardest path often leads to God's greatest plan. All of us would like to believe that if we do things well, life will go good for us. But as we saw through Joseph's story this morning, that isn't always the case. But Joseph's persistence to do what his father requested of him led him to actually some difficulty of betrayal and abandonment by his brothers. But Joseph isn't the only person in the Bible who did the right thing and got difficulty because of it. You see, Jesus, he also lived a perfect life. And he received undeserved betrayal and suffering. You see, because Jesus, like Joseph, was sent by his Father into the world to accomplish his plans and purposes. Because Jesus, just like Joseph, was rejected by his own people, particularly the religious leaders who plotted his death. You see, Jesus, just like Joseph, was also traded for pieces of silver. You see, Jesus, just like Joseph, was also stripped of his garments before his crucifixion. You see, Jesus, just like Joseph, also had to suffer an unjust at the hands of an just death on the cross, which brought about salvation to all who believe. And we know that Joseph's story is going to continue, and that ultimately he is going to save many people because of the things that God allows him to do. So just as Joseph's betrayal led to salvation of many, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection brought eternal salvation to the entire world. This story is a reminder for us that the harder path often leads to God's greater plan. And so when you are walking through a season of life that feels unfair, where you're being mistreated, maybe forgotten, maybe betrayed, remember that Joseph's story wasn't over and yours isn't either. Choose to continue to trust and walk with God as he leads and guides you, because he is always at work. And sometimes the harder path is actually leading you towards the greater plans that God has in store for your life.